1. These are experiences told to me by my mom. We live in Central America, by the way. This happened before I was born. Our house was placed at the back of our land, so we had a big front yard and a tall metal fence. One night my dad was outside hanging clothes, and he came running inside and said to my mom that somebody was coming in from the front fence. She scolded him and said that our fence was locked, so there was no way of anyone breaking in, and that it was just his imagination. Around this time, one of my dad's friends said that she had seen something standing behind my mom lately, but Mom was skeptic and thought his friend was trying to scare her. A few days later, around midnight, Mom was about to lock the main door in our house when she started to feel like the floor was shaking. Her first thought was that it was an earthquake, but then she saw how our living room tiles started to tear apart and the floor started to crack into a dark abyss. Dad and her quickly ran outside, and as soon as they got out, they started to throw up. My dad didn't puke as much, but my mother puked until blood came out. So Dad kind of knew that they were being hexed, and quickly went inside and grabbed some holy water that my grandma had brought from Costa Rica not long ago. He poured the water into Mom, and she immediately stopped puking. He also poured some into himself and into our home. Then they saw how some white smoke came out of the house. The next morning my aunt came by and saw the mess. He quickly contacted a shaman or curandero, I'm not sure. They brought lots of stuff for a cleansing ritual at our home. One of my uncles also passed by and told my mom that the spirit was sent with the intention of killing her, and that she's really lucky to be alive. Also, my dad never saw the floor cracking. The illusion was only seen by my mom. Fast forward to a few months after I've been born. My half-sister has been telling my mom to never let said family member, let's call him A, take me anywhere. One morning A came by and asked if he could take me out for a few photographs at a restaurant, and that he'd be back in a few hours. My mom refused, but my dad insisted on letting me go. He was close with A. Mom told him what my sis said, and he just brushed it off. So I was out all day until 5 p.m. Mom was mad because he said we'd be back sooner. That night, when the clock hit 1 a.m., I started crying non-stop. My dad immediately called A and asked him what's wrong with me, but he just told my dad to put a glass of water beneath my bed. That only worked the first night. The next night I was crying again, so Dad called A this time. He said to put a knife under the bed, and again it only worked once. The third night my mom got mad and swung the knife around, but it also worked that night. They couldn't bear it anymore, so they called for a family friend that's also a curandero. She came into our place and inspected my room, and said there was something strong in there and she needed to perform a ritual ASAP. So they went and bought all the stuff they needed. At that time, A used to hang out a lot with a Santera, so we suspect she used him to get to us. There was also this one time that my dad fought with a friend that practiced voodoo in Santeria. Dad was away for a few days and left Mom and me alone at home. His friend passed by and gave us a big doll-shaped present and left. It was around dusk, and as soon as Mom unwrapped the present, I started crying. Might have been a coincidence. The doll was an old lady with lots of wrinkles and was quite tall and creepy. Luckily, a cousin had just dropped by, so Mom asked him to dispose of the doll, and he quickly agreed and left with it. Nothing paranormal happened, but it's just plain weird to give somebody a creepy-ass old lady doll as a gift for no particular reason. Dad knew an awful lot of friends and family, by the way, and wasn't on good terms with some of them, so that's why some of them tried to harm us. I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, because I haven't experienced anything firsthand, but I believe in what my mother said. I'm also open to any possible suggestions that might have happened that have nothing to do with the paranormal. We don't have any mental issues, by the way. Is anyone a Santero or has gone through anything similar? I haven't heard of anyone dying to a hexing or a spirit, but who knows? 2. It was the house my family owned until my parents got divorced when I was 16. Located in a quaint part of Rhode Island. We only lived there for about 5 years, but I will always feel like that was the home I grew up in. It was huge, very old and beautiful. It was also haunted to hell. Something I didn't find out much later was that it was an old convalescent home. I am sure that people died there, and my parents didn't want my brother, sister, and I to know about it. 2 houses down, hidden behind some trees, is a very old historic cemetery. Used to smoke cigarettes there, as it was on the side of a dead end, and the brush hid the street from view. Some of the graves were so old you couldn't make the dates or names out. I and others had so many experiences in that house, it would take me quite a long time to explain all of them. But there's a few memorable ones that remain in my mind all these years later. My sister was little at the time. We heard crashing and a blood-curdling scream. Ran downstairs and she's sobbing in a corner, and the very old storage cabinet in the back hall that had been locked with a latch was busted open. The contents of which, just crap, boxes, frisbees, brooms, whatever, had been thrown out, like landed on the other side of the hall. She said it flew open when she walked past it, and we couldn't calm her down for an hour. I had a friend over one night, and we heard a little girl scream at the bottom of the stairs. I thought it was my sister and bolted down, but no one was there, and she was sound asleep in her bed upstairs. He never wanted to stay over again after that. Footsteps whenever you come home alone at night, coming from upstairs, heavy, slow ones, moving across from one end to the other. Voices. It would sound like when you leave a TV on in a room that's too quiet to make out. The high-pitched frequency from old TVs and everything. I would think I left my TV on in my room, go to shut it off, and the second I opened my door, be greeted with eerie silence. The girl I had a crush on in high school brought her over to my house. She got about 3 steps in and shrieked in front of my friends and ran out of the house. She was adamant that something had grabbed her and whispered in her ear. There were rooms in that house where it felt like eyes were burning in the back of your skull. There was a room hidden under the stairs, completely covered in children's writing and scratches. I've heard voices and been touched physically by hands that felt like rubber. If you were to offer me $1,000 to go in the basement after midnight right now, at 31 years old, I wouldn't do it. Just thinking about it gives me goosebumps. When my sister was 6, I and a few friends are almost certain she was possessed one night. There were multiple UFO occurrences that happened there as well, but that's another story in itself. That being said, I've had dreams about this house regularly since. Nightmares where I wake up and I'm inside there alone at night and it's abandoned. And there are dark forms that I realize aren't my family hiding in corners. Shadow hands that come from ceilings and walls. Whispers. I'll always wake up in the dream and find myself there at the dead of night, and it always feels like the house is calling me. Owners never stay there too long, and there was a time I woke up there in a dream, and I'm not totally convinced I was even dreaming, as I remember the entire walk home after. I recently found out that it's been abandoned, and I have such a strong urge to go there one night and break in, to peek around and see my old room one last time. It's been burning in the back of my mind. I loved that house, and had some of the best times of my life there, but I'm afraid what I might find if I go, and that I might find myself with the irresistible urge to wander into the basement, if I make it inside. 3. When I was in 3rd grade, my parents rented a really nice home in Irvine, my hometown. It was big enough for me and my 3 sisters, my mum, dad, and my uncle, who rented a room from us at the time. The landlord and landlady, Mr. and Mrs. Gans, were really friendly and sweet people. Mrs. Gans was a friend of my mum's. Anyway, about a month into us living at the home, we got a frantic phone call from Mrs. Gans. She told my mum that her husband committed suicide in their home. My mum has been pretty open with macabre subjects. Even when I was a child, she told me what happened. Fast forward to a week later, my elder sister and I shared a bedroom, and we had a computer and joystick in our room. This is important later. Well, one night our room got extremely cold. We didn't have the AC on, and our room had no windows. We went to sleep anyway. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange rattling noise. I got up to follow the noise, only to see my joystick rapidly moving back and forth on its own, as if someone was trying to play with it. The computer switch was also frantically switching on and off. When I got too close, the joystick abruptly stopped, and the computer switch was turned off again. I ran and told my parents, and my mum told me it was probably Mr. Gann's spirit. But why would he haunt our house when he had died in his own home? As the weeks and months went by, Mr. Gann standing in my bedroom doorway and trying to figure out our computer became a nightly occurrence. At this point, my sister got annoyed at him and told him to shut up because she's trying to sleep. His presence left the day we moved out, which was about a month later. On moving day, my dad, elder sister, and I were the last to leave. We can hear frantic, angry stomping and banging all throughout the house. My dad was mortified, and we all knew Mr. Gans was pissed. But we couldn't figure out why. We moved out quickly and never looked back. About a week ago, I brought this story up to my dad and asked him why Mr. Gans was so angry. My dad told me that back then my sisters drew on the walls and made messes and stained up the carpet with makeup that they stole from my mum's purse. Since Mr. and Mrs. Gans were our landlords, Mrs. Gans has not yet seen the state of the place, but Mr. Gans was definitely not pleased to see us leave the house in such a state. My dad wanted to clean up the place and repaint the walls before we left for good, but admittedly he was too scared to go back there after hearing Mr. Gans' ghostly, disembodied tantrum. I can't say I blame him. 4. This happened when I was 16 years old, so it's been almost 3 decades. But I still remember it clearly. That summer I was spending a lot of time at my friend Matt's house. His parents had both moved out, but hadn't sold the house yet, so we had the place to ourselves 99.9% of the time. There were almost always friends over, and the night this took place, there were at least 5 or 6 of us. We decided to visit a local cemetery late at night. I won't mention the name, because they have had huge problems with vandalism over the years, and the cemetery is basically off limits, save for relatives of the deceased. Knowing this, we dropped off our friends at the path into the cemetery, and then drove around the main road a half-mile and parked the car. Then Matt and I jogged back to meet them. They were already spooked, and the night just got creepier from there. We made it up to the cemetery, but barely. It seemed the sounds were coming from everywhere around us. Granted, we were teenagers, so our senses were probably a little overworked, but it felt like we were being watched. Needless to say, we didn't last long there. Everyone came to a unanimous decision that we were too scared to stay. We jogged to the car and drove back to Matt's house, which was a few miles away in a local neighborhood. Everyone was talking and having a good time except me. I was a bit emotional. The backstory is long, but to sum it up, the girl I liked at the time liked Matt instead, and she was there that night. So to distance myself from the situation, I went outside to get some fresh air. This was probably at least midnight by then. So the night was quiet and still. I was standing in the street, just basically feeling sorry for myself, and hoping the privacy would allow some time to collect my thoughts. When I turned around, I froze in place. There was a mist floating right in front of me. It didn't have a human shape per se, but it was tall and narrow rather than fog, which tends to be low and wide. This was definitely something abnormal. It was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck and completely shut down my fight-or-flight mode. I was scared stiff. It was no more than 5 feet away, just floating there. It didn't move. I didn't move. For what seemed like several minutes, I just stood there staring at it. Finally, I turned around and ran back into the house. I immediately told my friends what had occurred, but when they went outside to look, it had vanished. I have no doubt whatever this was, it had followed me and us from the cemetery. It was the most clearly paranormal experience I ever had. I've seen many a strange thing in my life, and labeled many of them as paranormal, but there was always an uncertainty about it. In this experience, there was no doubt what I saw. I've always wanted to visit the cemetery again. However, as I got older, I gained more respect for not tromping onto private property, and learned to let sleeping dogs lie. Sometimes it's best not to stir up the dust of an old memory, and just remember it as it was. 5. My grandparents had been married for 55 years when my grandfather passed away a few years ago. My grandfather was one of the most loving people I've ever met, and cared about his family more than anything. Before I get into this story, it's important to know that my grandmother lost 90% of her hearing. I've always been told that this was due to a bad case of the flu, but don't know the specifics, when she was in her 30s and had been deaf the majority of her adult life. My grandparents lived in a small house out in the country, about 20 minutes out of town, which they loved but became concerning when they reached old age because of how remote they were if anything bad were to happen. In the year that my grandfather passed, he passed in November, his health began to steadily decline. But he was very stubborn about staying active and continuing to do the things he loves, one of which was piddling out in the yard. This included fixing anything he could find that needed be with his various tools and scrap parts he had collected over the years. One day in the spring before he died, while washing up for dinner, he noticed his wedding ring was missing from his finger. He had lost a lot of weight, and we finally assumed that the ring had most likely fallen off his finger somewhere in the yard. My grandfather was a large man, and at this point had lost nearly 100 pounds from when he was healthy. We searched high and low for that ring for months, praying that it would turn up, but never with any luck. Now back to my grandmother. With Papa's days numbered, he began increasingly worrying about her living in their house alone while being deaf. My mother, though very attentive, is an only child and lives roughly 30 minutes from her mother if something were to happen, and the few neighbors there are often out of town. My grandmother had been told by her audiologist that she would be a perfect candidate for a cochlear implant, and the device would greatly improve her hearing, but with my grandfather being sick, she never thought twice about declining it, as she knew it would hinder her ability to care for him. In my grandfather's last days, he urged her to have the surgery as a dying wish, so she could keep her independence, and she finally agreed. She had the implant put in January of the following year, a little over a month after my grandfather's passing. I don't know all the technicalities of the post-op process, but she had to wait several weeks after surgery to be able to turn on the device, during which time she was totally, note she was 90% deaf before, deaf. She became severely depressed during this time, not only from the recovery process, but also she greatly missed my grandfather and was having a hard time adjusting to living alone. The first week in February, she went back to her doctor to activate the device, but to her dismay, her hearing was nowhere near what she thought it would be. The doctor told her this was normal, and that there would be a long rehab period where she would have to train her brain to understand the device. But I believe she thought it would be somewhat instant, and this only discouraged her more. The following week was the first Valentine's Day she had spent alone in 55 years. It was all she could do to pull herself out of bed and make a pot of coffee that for so long had been shared with my grandfather. She took her cup of coffee and sat on the edge of his bed. They had separate rooms since I was little because of his snoring, and began to tear up. For some reason she had the urge to look down, and sitting there right in the middle of the bedroom floor was my papa's wedding ring he had lost nearly a year prior. She called my mother in hysterics, who immediately rushed out there thinking something terrible had happened. When my mom got there, she couldn't help but cry with her. We had all been in and out of that room countless times, and there's no way that ring could have been sitting there going unnoticed by any of us for an entire year. I know, as crazy as it is, some people will find ways to try to explain it, but I feel like that was his way of saying I love you, and I'm still here. It's been 3 years now, and my grandmother is doing much better. I can proudly even hear birds chirping outside. We still have the ring, and one day I plan to give it to my future husband. As to me, it is undoubtedly a symbol of undying love. Hey everybody, Hal Freezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 105. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Well, once more we head into the weekend, and we're in October already. So I'll probably start doing a little bit of the groundwork for my 10 Days of Halloween thing. I've already picked a few stories out, so I'll get to researching on that. And I'll probably start recording those at some point over the next week or so. Just so that everything's in place and ready to go for Halloween week. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.